I say stands up on its own. That's it. That's what happened. No more mystery. No more speculation. The end of the Merrill case.
Well, I didn't believe Miss Furness, but I checked, and she really was the daughter of the house. But I didn't believe she played Merrill in any of the séances. But if the whole thing took place just as Livingston described it, then what can be the explanation? I'd like you to have a look at this film. It was taken in Reykjavik, Iceland, with an infrared camera and has been proved to be completely authentic. It depicts some phenomena very much like what I think happened in the Merrill case, you see. I believe that Merrill really was the materialisation of a 7-year-old girl who had been dead for several years. My own theory for what it's is that material, you know, from what the materialised being is formed, is called ectoplasm. And this sort of ectoplasm is a sort of neutral substance with no cloud, you know, no taste, no smell, no texture, no nothing. And it's sort of brought into existence by the exertions, the powerful exertions, yeah, of a medium out of her own body, though it has nothing to do with normal flesh and blood, you know, as we understand. Well, this ectoplasm is then sort of moulded by, you know, paranormal forces which ain't got any sort of physical qualities of their own. And these forces sort of, well, impress themselves on the ectoplasm and sort of mould themselves, the body, with whatever sort of characteristics they need. I mean, in the Merrill case, the spirit of the little girl, you know, used the ectoplasm to mould the form it had when it was alive. My own suspicion is that Mrs. Smith was the medium, yeah. Well then, to sort of sum up, I believe that on that evening in February 5 years ago, George Livingston took part in one of the most amazing and irrefutable supernatural events that has ever been recorded.
Well, at this point I enter the story. My name's Delan. I'm what they call a psychologist. Some months ago I came across Miss Oliver's documentary on the little ghost girl. She convinced me that something very odd had taken place on that mysterious evening, but she didn't win me with her explanation. I know. No. So I decided to open up my own very private eye and peer, with as much penetration as I could muster, into the depths. Now, I went after those who'd known Livingston throughout his career, and in particular his wife, who told me about his mood at the time of the séance. She said he'd reached 50 the previous year and was going through what she'd heard described as the male menopause. And to be sure, that's the sort of word they'd use these days. Now, just what can we make of this unusual case? But to put it plainly, I think that what happened that February evening was an example of group hallucination. And indeed, the group hallucination had been going on in that house for a tidy old time. The important thing about hallucinations are that you have to both crave for and believe in whatever you hallucinate. These are the twin passions needed to bring forth miracles.
Of course, I'm not suggesting for a moment that the Cricklewood Circle had consciously worked out all these things. Far from it. I'm talking about unconscious and intuitive processes evolved over long periods. Now, we've heard they believed it perfectly possible for departed souls to materialize before the living. But why, we must ask ourselves, should that be? Well, in the case of Mrs. Brown, I should think the answer is obvious. Hadn't she lost her only daughter and yearned to be reunited with her? As for the family Smith, well, The parents had also lost a daughter. Not only the same sort of age as... Well, after the ceremonies of introduction, Mrs. Brown gave a detailed and graphic description, a menu, one might say, of what was going to appear at the séance. But this wasn't simply for Livingston's benefit, but for everyone in the room, herself included. By her recitation, she was reminding, resuggesting, reinforcing exactly what it'd be they'd all be experiencing shortly. And she was also ensuring they'd all experience exactly the same thing at exactly the same time.
I cannot tell if I'm dreaming while I'm awake, but it continued to happen for many nights, and I'd be worried.
But how did they go about synchronizing themselves? Well, they plant a communally accepted device. Now, this acts as a subconscious trigger in each mind for the supernatural to make its entrance. And so we have all the ingredients for the exercise, except one: sensory deprivation. Now, the important thing about sensory deprivation is the individual loses all sensory orientation and becomes suspended in a limbo out of which anything might come. You see, when you're completely out of contact with everyday reality, you're free to arrange any new reality you fancy. You suit yourself. Now, sure, it's darkness and silence you need if you're after fashioning up infants from the dead. So back there in Cricklewood, once the lights are out, our friends are in the right condition. Apart from their backsides perched on the chairs, they sense practically nothing. They sit, with hands unclasped without touching one another, perfectly still in the total darkness and in unbroken silence. Now, as the minutes go by, Livingston tells us he began to lose all comprehension of time and began to develop in some slight degree a sensation of being somewhat suspended in spatial terms. And then... why, by all the saints, should he do such an incongruous thing? It was the signal I mentioned earlier, the trigger for Mariel to begin. And likewise, hours later, the clock striking 11 in the hall. That was the signal telling everyone they could now stop hallucinating.
Now, I've talked about everyone's motives for hallucinating except George Livingston's. Now, what in a month of Sundays should he be hallucinating for? Well, let's just see what we can piece together.
Now, his wife told me at the time of the séance he was depressed, and his colleagues echoed the same thing. He'd lost all hope of finding genuine phenomena. I think by early 1969, Livingston felt like a spent man. Like a man spent searching after the fabled water horse and finding nothing but mats of weed. And what is a man spent like that to do with himself? How is he to spend his future? Well, he won't be spending it at all, for he hasn't it to hand over. What can a spent man do but give up the ghost? Give up the ghost, yes. Yes, but wait a minute. If you really need a ghost, desperately need a ghost, can't live without one, then there's one place you're certain to find it. In the depths of your own skull. But you'd best be careful. To be sure, the human mind is a very strange business. A man has to be very careful about fooling himself. Mustn't let the right lobe know what the left lobe is doing, so to speak. We're talking about legerdemain of the mind. Our man subconsciously decided to find himself a phenomenon. No, not a phenomenon you'd absolutely have to believe in. Just one you couldn't get around. So he waited. And when the call came from Cricklewood, something in what the caller said told him subconsciously that here was the opening he'd been waiting for. That's why we find him breaking all his usual conditions. And if one thinks about it, isn't it easy to see how going alone and never going back were essential for his own subconscious purpose? To be sure, they'd defend the mystery against solution.